Lyuba looks like she is sleeping, curled on her side, eyes closed, skin intact, every toe and eyelash still in place after 42,000 years frozen in Siberian mud. She was long considered the best preserved baby mammoth ever recovered, a title only later challenged by another specimen found several years afterward. For years, that peaceful appearance shaped how people assumed she died, quietly, gently, maybe from cold or exhaustion after losing her mother's herd somewhere on the ancient Siberian tundra. What scientists actually found lodged inside her trunk and throat told a completely different story, one that had nothing peaceful about it at all. In May of 2007, a Nenets reindeer herder named Yuri Hudi was traveling with three of his sons along the Uribay River on Russia's Yamal Peninsula when they spotted a small carcass resting on a sandbar. Hudi had spent his life finding mammoth tusks eroding out of the permafrost, the thick, honey-colored spirals his people encountered nearly every summer, but never a complete animal. The Net's tradition holds that touching mammoth remains brings bad luck, tied to old stories describing the creatures as beasts that wander the underworld. So Hudi left the body untouched and traveled roughly 150 miles to consult a friend, Kirill Serateto, who in turn brought in the director of the local museum in the town of Yarsail. Local authorities arranged a flight to retrieve the carcass, but by the time anyone made it back to the site, it had vanished entirely. It turned up days later propped against the side of a shop in a nearby settlement. Kudi's own cousin had sold the carcass to the shop owner in exchange for 2 snowmobiles and a year's supply of food, and stray dogs had already chewed off part of the right ear and tail before police intervened, confiscated the remains, and had them flown by helicopter to a museum in the regional capital of Salekhardt. Alexei Tikhonov, director of the Zoological Museum in St. Petersburg, was among the first scientists to examine her, and it was Kudi himself credited with the discovery despite everything that happened afterward, who chose her name, Lyuba, after his wife. Radiocarbon testing placed her age at roughly 42,000 years, and dental development showed she had died just 30 to 35 days after birth, barely a month old. Aside from missing hair and toenails, her body was almost completely intact, weighing about 50 kilograms, close to the size of a large dog, with her trunk, eyes, ears, and even the milk still in her digestive system preserved well enough to study directly. Paleontologist Daniel Fisher of the University of Michigan, who had already spent decades studying mammoth remains by the time Lyuba surfaced, was brought in alongside French mammoth researcher Bernard Bouigues to lead the scientific investigation into exactly what had happened to her, beginning a research process that would ultimately stretch on for years before producing a real answer. If you learned something new, be sure to subscribe. The earliest working theory was simple and intuitive. A baby mammoth found near a river, her body remarkably intact with no obvious wounds or bite marks from predators, fit naturally into the assumption that she had drowned, a conclusion put forward by Russian researcher Pavel Kosintsev and colleagues in 2010 after their initial examination of the carcass, based largely on her location and the general condition of her remains. It made sense on the surface, and for a specimen this fragile, a straightforward drowning was also the simplest possible explanation available without more invasive testing. It did not survive closer inspection. Actually seeing what was happening inside her body took years, largely because Lyuba herself was the obstacle. She was too large and too fragile for a standard medical CT scanner to capture in a single pass, roughly the size of a small elephant calf, but dense enough with preserved soft tissue to defeat the machines available. Researchers first attempted a scan not long after her discovery, when French mammoth researcher Bernard Bouigues arranged for her to be flown to Japan by refrigerated container so that radiologist Naoki Suzuki at the GK University School of Medicine in Tokyo could examine her using hospital equipment. That scan confirmed her skeleton and organs were remarkably undamaged and picked up dense material filling her trunk and throat, but a machine built for human patients still could not capture her entire body at once. A later attempt in Wisconsin ran into the same limitation. The breakthrough finally came in October of 2010 at a Ford Motor Company testing facility in Livonia, Michigan, using an industrial scanner originally built to detect flaws inside vehicle transmissions rather than examine biological tissue. For the first time, researchers had a complete, non-destructive look at everything inside her without cutting into a specimen so rare that preserving it intact mattered as much as studying it. What they found did not match a drowning at all. The scans revealed a dense, compacted mass of fine-grained sediment blocking her trunk, crammed into her throat, and lodged deep in her bronchial passages, concentrated specifically in her airway rather than spread evenly through her deeper lung tissue, the way water typically fills the lungs of an animal that drowns in open water. Mixed into that sediment were small blue crystals of a mineral called vivianite, an iron and phosphate compound that forms specifically in cold, low-oxygen, waterlogged settings like the bottom of a lake, giving researchers a remarkably precise picture of the exact environment she had died in, decades before anyone could have tested for it directly, and a level of environmental detail no amount of simply looking at her preserved skin could ever have provided. Even more telling, her stomach still contained undigested milk, clear evidence she had been nursing normally right up until the moment of death. An animal that had simply drowned after a prolonged struggle in open water would not still be digesting a recent meal that cleanly. Something faster and far more violent had happened instead. None of this evidence could have been gathered by cutting Lyuba open, which is precisely why the non-destructive scanning mattered so much in the first place. Researchers involved in her study operated under strict conditions limiting how much of her body could be dissected or sampled, since she remained one of only a handful of mammoth mummies complete enough to preserve for future study using techniques that do not even exist yet, methods that might one day extract even more detail from her tissue than anything available today. A full CT scan let scientists see everything sealed inside her without compromising a specimen. This irreplaceable, a trade-off that would have been unthinkable for researchers working just a decade or two earlier, before industrial-grade scanning became sensitive enough to read soft tissue this clearly, and long before anyone imagined an automotive testing lab designed to catch defects in car parts would end up solving a 42,000-year-old mystery instead. That single choice of venue, an industrial facility rather than a hospital or a university, turned out to matter more than almost anyone involved could have predicted going in. Fisher's team concluded that Lyuba had suffocated, not drowned, likely after breaking through lake ice or stumbling into deep, waterlogged mud during a river or lake crossing with her herd, inhaling a forceful, reflexive breath of thick sediment directly into her airway in a final, desperate attempt to breathe. The distinction between drowning and this particular form of asphyxiation might sound like a technicality, but it changes the entire picture of her final moments. Drowning suggests a prolonged struggle in open water, minutes of swimming and exhaustion before the end, precisely the situation in which her own mother might reasonably have been expected to intervene and pull her free. What the scans described instead was closer to a sudden accident, a single catastrophic breath that filled her airway before she had any real chance to struggle at all, fast enough that even a mother standing right beside her might not have had time to help. That single detail solved a second mystery at the same time. Lyuba's mummified face carries a distinct dent across her forehead, just above her trunk, a feature that had puzzled observers since her discovery and shows up clearly in nearly every photograph taken of her. Fisher proposed that the same violent, convulsive inhalation that filled her trunk with mud may have simultaneously created a partial vacuum at its base as she gasped for air, pulling the soft tissue inward and flattening it against her skull, an injury pattern entirely consistent with sudden asphyxiation rather than the slow, gentle death her sleeping appearance had always seemed to suggest. Subscribe to not miss the next one. Lyuba wasn't studied alone. In October of 2008, a mammoth ivory hunter working the Permafrost near the Khroma River in northeastern Yakutia, more than 3,000 miles from where Lyuba had been found, discovered a second mammoth calf frozen upright in the ground, preserved in a standing position as though she had simply been caught mid-stride. Scavengers, likely Arctic foxes and ravens, had already eaten her heart, lungs, and parts of her trunk and skull before researchers could recover the body, but enough remained for Fisher's team to bring her into direct comparison with Lyuba, creating the first opportunity anyone had ever had to study the skeletal development of two mammoths of precisely known age side by side. Dental analysis placed this second calf, named Khroma, after the river where she was found, at 52 to 57 days old at death, roughly 2 months, and radiocarbon testing found her age exceeded the technique's 45,000-year limit entirely, meaning she is older than any other baby mammoth ever recovered, Lyuba included, though exactly how much older remains unknown since the dating method simply runs out of range. Khroma's CT scan told a strikingly similar story despite the scavenging damage. Sediment was packed into her trunk, mouth, and throat as well, and although her lungs were missing, her stomach still contained undigested milk, so fresh and pale that Fisher later described it as looking almost exactly like a freshly opened container of yogurt, indicating she had been nursing less than an hour before she died. Her spinal column showed a clean fracture consistent with a sudden fall, and researchers proposed that she and her mother may have been standing together on a riverbank when it gave way beneath them, pitching both mammoths into the water below and accounting for both the broken spine and the mud driven into her airway during the collapse. Lay both calves side by side and a pattern emerges that neither specimen could have revealed on its own. Both were healthy, well-fed, and thriving in the days before they died. Dental records for each showing no signs of illness, malnutrition, or developmental stress that might otherwise explain a weakened animal succumbing more easily to its environment. Neither slowly declined, neither starved, both were killed suddenly in what researchers describe as violent accidents tied to the exact same seasonal danger, river crossings and lake ice during the spring thaw, precisely the hazard a mammoth herd would have faced every single year as it followed its migratory routes across the Siberian landscape in search of fresh grazing. Separated by 3,000 miles and quite possibly thousands of years, two mammoth calves from entirely different populations died the same way, drowning not in the sense most people picture, but suffocating on the sediment their own bodies inhaled in a final, desperate breath. That pattern matters for more than just two individual animals. Complete mammoth calf skeletons of confirmed age are exceptionally rare, since most remains found in the permafrost are partial, scavenged, or too badly decomposed to study in this level of detail, and Lyuba and Khroma remain to date the only two ever recovered intact enough to support this kind of comparison. Fisher himself has described the pair as reference points for interpreting every other isolated mammoth calf bone or bone fragment ever pulled from the ground, since researchers now have two fully preserved, precisely aged skeletons to measure any new partial discovery against. Every partial or fragmentary calf skeleton found before or since gets measured against the developmental benchmarks these two specimens established, meaning the true significance of both animals extends far beyond their own individual deaths and into how scientists interpret every other incomplete mammoth remain ever pulled from the permafrost. What began as the story of an unusually well-preserved baby mammoth, calm and intact enough to look almost peaceful, ended up revealing something considerably more violent hiding just beneath her skin. Lyuba did not drift off quietly after being separated from her herd, and she did not simply drown the way the earliest examination assumed. She suffocated in a single, forceful moment, her airway clogged with the exact sediment that would later tell scientists precisely where and how she died, 42,000 years after the fact, a detail no visual examination could ever have uncovered on its own. Khroma's discovery roughly a year and a half later, and the direct comparison her body made possible, confirmed that Lyuba's death was not some isolated fluke, but part of a recurring, predictable danger built into mammoth migration itself, one that claimed at least two known calves from opposite ends of Siberia under nearly identical circumstances. The calm, sleeping expression that made Lyuba famous around the world, reproduced in photographs, museum tours, and documentaries for close to 2 decades now, told only half the story. The mud packed inside her, invisible from the outside and readable only once scanning technology finally caught up to what she'd been hiding, told the rest.